Calidor was not a world for the soft-hearted. Its skies burned crimson with constant storms, and its crust belched fire without warning. It was a planet that seemed to resent its own existence, chewing up anything foolish enough to touch down on its surface. And Captain Adrian Wells had just landed squarely in the mouth of it. His boots sank into ash-thick soil as he stepped from the ramp of the Starhawk, visor flicking through spectrum filters to pierce the roiling haze. This wasn't a vacation stop. It was a suspected illegal mining colony site, unregistered, deep in Pyronax territory. The Pyronax weren't known for subtlety or kindness. Half-molten creatures of fire worship and primal brutality, they'd long ago been banished from most civilized sectors. But out here, on the edge of galactic law, they still thrived. Adrian's orders were clear: investigate, confirm, report. But as he crept over a jagged ridge of obsidian rock, what he saw below sent his hand immediately to the rifle strapped across his back. There was a fire pit. Massive, ritualistic, surrounded by a crowd of Pyronax warriors beating bone drums and howling in a language that sounded like magma being squeezed through stone. And above that roaring pyre, mounted on a spit that turned slowly with mechanical precision, was a living being. She was humanoid, barely, her skin a glistening tapestry of luminous silver and soft coral hues, eyes closed, bound in shackles of glowing iron. She wasn't screaming, she was past that. Her head hung low, limp, resigned. The Pyronax were celebrating. She was their centerpiece. Adrian's mouth went dry. He didn't know who she was, but he didn't need a dossier to tell him she didn't belong there. This was no prisoner exchange. This was a feast. A living creature seconds from being roasted alive and torn apart by hands that still called fire divine. He ducked back behind the ridge, mind racing. He had no backup, no extraction window, no tactical map, just himself. And one desperate decision: if he waited, she'd be dead. He tightened his grip on his rifle and muttered under his breath, "Guess we're doing this the stupid way." Then he moved. The descent from the ridge was madness. Adrian barely paused to aim. He needed chaos more than accuracy. His first shot blew apart a fuel drum beside the pyre, sending a plume of fire straight into the crowd. The shockwave sent Pyronax warriors stumbling. Their chants shattered. The drumbeat faltered. The second shot hit the motor, turning the spit, freezing it in place. The third hit a horned brute square between the eyes before he could react. Adrian charged. They roared in fury, but disarray was his ally. He weaved through the confusion, heart hammering, smoke curling around him like a living thing. The heat was unbearable even through his exo-armor. The fire licked the hem of the alien's hair. She stirred. Barely. He reached the spit and slammed his gauntlet into the binding controls. The ancient tech sparked and fought him, but he overrode it with brute force, pulling the shackles free with a wrenching twist that made the bones in his arm creak. She collapsed into his arms, weightless. Her skin was hot to the touch, but not burning, alive, barely. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she stared at him, dazed. He didn't stop. He turned and ran. Blades hissed through the air behind him. One Pyronax lunged from the side, but Adrian twisted and drove a shock blade into its gut, never losing momentum. Another came at him with a hammer of molten stone. He ducked, pivoted, fired a burst into its knee, then shoved forward through the gathering fury. The Starhawk loomed ahead, ramp still open, engines humming like a heartbeat. The fire from the pit cast shadows across the hull. As Adrian sprinted up the ramp, a Pyronax hurled a javelin of burning metal after him. It missed by inches, skidding across the floor and embedding itself in the wall. He slammed the ramp controls and laid the alien woman gently onto the med bench. "Hang on," he told her, breathless. "You're not dinner yet." She looked at him, blinking slowly, lips parting as if to speak. No words came. Then she fainted. Adrian turned and raced for the cockpit. As the Starhawk lifted off, engines flaring against the wrath of Calidor's skies, he allowed himself a glance through the rear monitor. The Pyronax camp shrank beneath them, still wreathed in flame and smoke. He leaned back in the pilot's seat, heart still thudding. "Well," he muttered, "that was either the dumbest or most heroic thing I've ever done." From the medbay, her voice whispered faintly through the intercom, surprising him. "Both," she said. Then the line went silent, and Adrian realized she wasn't unconscious anymore. The hum of the Starhawk's engines dulled as it slipped into orbit, leaving the scorched breath of Calidor behind. Adrian sat on the edge of the medbay bench, cradling a sterilizer in one hand and a med patch in the other, watching the alien woman with guarded curiosity. Her wounds were superficial, burns and abrasions mostly, but she hadn't made a sound since whispering that single word back on the ship. She was awake now, eyes half-lidded, breathing steady, her silver-pink skin rising and falling with an alien rhythm. There was something about her stillness, not fear, not weakness, but measured calm. As if she'd spent her entire life preparing to be burned, and now that the flames had failed, she was trying to remember how to live. Adrian cleared his throat. Name? Her gaze slid toward him, large eyes, luminous, almost crystalline. Zariah, she said softly, of the Varanth fold. He frowned. Never heard of it. I wouldn't expect you to. Most haven't. She tried to sit up, winced, then stubbornly forced herself upright. Adrian moved to support her, but she brushed off his hand with quiet resolve. She was stronger than she looked, thin-limbed, delicate in the way fine glass is delicate, but not breakable. He respected that. You were on Calidor for what? He asked. Research? Diplomacy? Neither. I was not supposed to be there. I was looking for something. He leaned back, one brow rising, and got captured by a tribe of cannibalistic fire worshippers. Her eyes narrowed slightly. They call it a sacred ritual. I call it something else. Adrian let the silence stretch. He'd seen his share of war crimes wrapped in religion. There was always a belief to dress up barbarism. He just hadn't expected to stumble into it on a planet most governments had written off as uninhabitable. Zariah looked at her hands. They said my flesh would bring them the heat of stars. Adrian blinked. Charming. They hunted me for 3 days. I was never meant to escape. But you did. He stood, walked to the console, keyed in coordinates for the nearest Terran port. You escaped. That's what matters. She didn't respond. Her expression said she wasn't convinced. You want me to drop you off at a neutral station? He asked. Or somewhere more hidden? Zariah looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing not just his words, but the shape of his soul behind them. No, she said at last. Stay with me, please. Adrian's hands hovered over the console. The stars ahead were a sea of possibilities, but there was something in her voice, fragile and unfamiliar, that kept him from replying with sarcasm. Instead, he nodded. All right, for now. And somewhere in the silence between them, something shifted. Not a rescue, not yet a bond, but a choice. Adrian dreamt of flame that night. Not fire that consumed. It had done enough of that on Calidor, but fire with a face. Fire that stared at him with molten eyes and whispered, She's not what you think. He woke with sweat on his neck and the ship drifting quietly through a belt of dark asteroids like teeth. Zariah was already awake. She stood barefoot at the viewport, wearing a draped blanket like a robe, her reflection cast in the cold blue starlight. He approached slowly. You don't sleep much. I've had too many dreams, she said, not turning. Some were mine, some weren't. That gave him pause. She finally looked at him, something bright and brittle dancing behind her gaze. I can feel them still, she said. The Pyranax. Not just their hands or their knives, I felt their fire, what it wanted, what it remembered. Adrian crossed his arms. You said they thought your flesh could give them heat. They weren't wrong, she whispered. He frowned. Explain. Zariah turned fully now. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing the edges of what looked like a burn, but instead of scar tissue, the mark shimmered with faint pulses of energy beneath her skin, like veins of starlight. She took his hand gently and pressed it to the center of her sternum. What he felt wasn't a heartbeat. It was a current. Power. Alive and ancient. My people were bred in the heart of binary stars, she said. We were designed to channel stellar radiation, store it, use it. I am not just a body. I'm fuel, sacred to some, dangerous to others. Adrian pulled his hand back slowly, and the Pyranax knew that. They don't just burn, she said. They feed. They were going to devour me, not just flesh, but everything I am, until you came. Adrian paced once, then stopped. So you're telling me I pulled a living sun off a spit, and now every fire-worshipping warband in the system might be tracking us for dessert? A glint of humor touched her lips. That is a colorful way of putting it. He exhaled, terrific. She stepped closer. If I go alone, I might draw them away. No, he said before she could finish. That's not how this ends. Zariah blinked. You barely know me. Adrian met her gaze without flinching. I don't need to know someone to know what I won't let happen to them. Her voice softened. You don't have to protect me. You're right, he said. I don't have to, but I want to. That stopped her. For the first time since they met, her shoulders eased, just slightly. Then, outside the viewport, a small red light blinked into existence. A proximity ping. Adrian walked to the console. We've got company. Zariah's tone dropped. Pyranax? Let's find out. The ship began to shift, gliding into defensive posture. Beneath their feet, the hum of weapons charging echoed softly through the deck, and behind them, the stars burned, watching, waiting. The first blast came like a hammer to the hull. The Starhawk reeled mid-drift, its frame shuddering under a concussive bolt that painted the starlit void with a sudden, savage bloom of plasma. Adrian slammed back into the pilot's chair, fingers dancing across the console, as the proximity alarms screamed and the ship's stabilizers fought to recover. Zariah braced against the wall, the energy crackling beneath her skin flaring bright for a breath before subsiding. Her expression was eerily calm, like she'd expected this moment to find her, no matter how far they ran. Adrian cursed under his breath. Pyranax scout frigate, small, fast, and mad enough to follow us into an asteroid field. He brought the ship into a sharp dive, weaving between tumbling rock, the darkness outside flickering with explosive ripples as the enemy continued their barrage. The scout ship behind them was ugly and jagged, stitched together with stolen tech and tribal ferocity. It looked more like a predator's jaw than a spacecraft. We can't outrun it, he muttered, shields at 60%. Zariah stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the deck. Let me help. You're not a weapon, he shot back, adjusting power flow to the dorsal cannons. I don't want to be, she said, eyes glowing faintly. But I won't watch them take everything from me again. Her hands hovered above the ship's reactor core conduit, a silver-threaded line running along the floor, pulsing with artificial life. She closed her eyes. The lights inside the ship dimmed. Then the energy surged, purer, brighter, as if the reactor had taken a deep breath and remembered it was born from starlight. Adrian glanced at the readout. Power levels had spiked beyond regulation thresholds. The engines roared with new strength. He didn't ask questions. He turned the ship and fired. Twin plasma bolts lanced out from the Starhawk's cannons, screaming into the dark. One went wide. The other struck true, piercing the Pyranax vessel's left flank. The scout ship wavered, listed hard, then corrected course and came on even faster. They're not going to stop, Adrian growled. Zariah's hand touched his shoulder. Then neither will we. He flew them deeper into the asteroid field, dragging the enemy with them. It was a brutal ballet of reflex and raw instinct, rock and flame, metal and madness. But at last, Adrian banked low beneath a ridge of ancient iron-rich stone and veered hard left. The Pyranax ship followed, and collided headfirst with a silent, drifting asteroid the size of a freighter. The impact didn't create fire, it created silence. In the still that followed, Adrian sat back, breathing hard, sweat glistening along his jaw. Zariah watched the drifting wreckage outside. Her voice was quiet. That won't be the last one. No, he agreed, but it's the last for now. She didn't move for a moment. Then she asked, Why are you still here, Captain? He turned toward her. I mean, she continued, you rescued me. You had your moment of heroism. You could have left me at a station, handed me off to some diplomat. Why are you still risking your life? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, Because I don't like the idea of fire deciding who gets to live. She blinked. He shrugged. And maybe because I've been drifting a long time. Too long. You gave the drift meaning. She looked at him, really looked, like she was seeing him for the first time. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that held grief and hope in the same breath. And in that silence, with the stars wheeling above them and the wreckage of their enemies still drifting behind, something warm began to grow. Not yet love, but something ready to become it. They found a quiet moon. It circled a gas giant with slow grace, its surface frozen and barren, its crust smooth from ages of windless silence. Adrian set the Starhawk down on a flat plateau near the edge of a shattered crater. He needed repairs. The ship's hull was cracked, the internal gyro was struggling, and the secondary comms array had melted during the last skirmish. But more than repairs, he needed stillness, and so did she. Zariah stepped out onto the moon's surface like she was tasting something familiar. She stood at the edge of the crater, her hair trailing in the artificial breeze of her atmosphere field, her eyes fixed on the stars above. Adrian joined her. "This place always quiet?" "It's old," she said. "I can feel it." "Feel it?" She turned, and her smile was softer than he'd ever seen it. "I wasn't lying. My people were forged near suns. Our bodies remember heat, but our minds remember songs." He watched her kneel and place a hand against the stone. For a moment there was no sound but the faint hum of the ship behind them. Then the stone beneath her hand began to glow. Faintly, just a pulse. Adrian felt it too, like an echo inside his chest, a heartbeat not his own. She looked up at him. "Do you hear it?" "I hear something," he said, voice low. "It's the memory of the planet, the heat it once held, the fires that shaped it." She stood, brushing her fingers along her collarbone where her skin still pulsed with a faint inner glow. "That's how my people survived. We carried the memory of stars wherever we went." He stepped closer. "That's why they wanted you." She nodded. "Not because I'm powerful, but because I'm rare. Because the old ways said consuming someone like me would bring divine strength." Adrian's hands clenched. "They're not divine, they're cowards." She placed a hand over his. "Not all fire destroys." He looked at her then, not as the alien woman he'd pulled from a pyre, but as something much deeper. A survivor not of war, but of erasure. She had been marked to vanish, to be devoured and forgotten. But she stood here now, sharing warmth not just from her body, but from something older, something eternal. "You saved me," she said. "I got you off the spit," he replied. "You're saving yourself." She stepped forward, inches away now, her voice a whisper. "I don't want to run anymore." He met her gaze. "Then we stand. Together." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They stood there, palm to palm, as the stone beneath them remembered the stars. And for the first time in her long life, Zariah didn't feel hunted. She felt held. The repairs to the Starhawk took days. Adrian worked tirelessly, stripping the damaged outer paneling, reprogramming the stabilizer gyros, rerouting fractured conduits. The entire left side of the ship had suffered micro-fissures from the asteroid collision, and the power core had to be calibrated with exacting precision. Anything less and they'd fry themselves on their next jump. Zariah stayed close, offering more than company. Her touch could regulate the energy fluctuations in the core, calming the volatile radiation with a kind of intimate understanding no machine could replicate. When she ran her fingers over the core conduit, it responded like a living thing, humming with something almost reverent. Adrian watched her work in silence, often forgetting the tools in his hands. She had a way of moving that made the world quieter, like everything fell into rhythm with her heartbeat. When she concentrated, her skin shimmered faintly, pulses of soft light traveling across her forearms like silver fire beneath her flesh. He had no words for it. He only knew that it reminded him what it meant to be alive. One night, with the repairs nearly complete, they sat outside the ship again, wrapped in the synthetic warmth of their atmosphere field. The stars stretched endlessly above them. A cold silence surrounded the crater, but neither of them felt alone in it. "I should have died," Zariah said, her voice low. "You didn't," Adrian replied. "I was ready. On that spit I let go. I felt the fire. I let it in." She paused, her gaze distant. "Then you came through it like it meant nothing." He shook his head. "It meant everything. I was just too angry to stop." Zariah smiled faintly. "You didn't see me as fuel." "No," Adrian said. "I saw you as someone who didn't deserve to be consumed." She turned to him, her eyes catching the faint light from the ship behind them. "And now?" He met her gaze. "Now I see someone who burns brighter than anything I've ever known." She didn't laugh or blush. She only reached for his hand and placed it gently over her heart. Beneath the smooth surface of her skin, the thrum of energy was steady, warm, alive. "Then stay," she said. "Don't save me again. Just stay." He leaned in, resting his forehead to hers. "I'm not going anywhere." And under a sky born long before either of them existed, fire met flesh not in violence, but in trust. The serenity shattered the next morning. Adrian was running a final diagnostic on the Starhawk's nav systems when the proximity scanner lit up like a wounded beast. The readout flashed a single word in crimson: "Transmission detected." But it wasn't local, it was internal. He tapped the console, brought the signal up. It was encrypted in a language the Terran systems didn't recognize, fractured, looping, organic, in a way machine code shouldn't be. Zariah arrived at his side before he could call her. She stared at the screen, eyes widening. "It's them," she whispered. Adrian didn't ask how she knew. He just asked, "How bad?" "They're not searching anymore. They've found us." Her words came like frost. The signal was a beacon, not a call, but a warning. The Pyranax were close, too close. And they weren't sending scouts this time. He raced to the outer array to scan the perimeter. The sensor returned a pulse echo, slow and distant but unmistakably artificial. One vessel, no registration, but massive. A flagship, the kind that didn't chase, the kind that consumed. Zariah stood behind him, her expression unreadable. "They've sent the Flamebound." Adrian turned. "What the hell is that?" "Their priest ship. It's not a vessel. It's a floating altar, where they anoint their chosen sacrifices and boil the stars into prophecy." His pulse quickened. "They want you back. They want to finish what you stopped." He turned back to the sensor. "Then we don't give them that chance." But even as he said it, he knew the Starhawk couldn't outrun that ship. Not anymore. The repairs had given them speed, but not stealth. And now the Pyranax had something they hadn't shown before: patience. They were circling, waiting. Zariah stepped forward, her voice quiet. "There is one way." He looked at her, already hating the tone in her voice. She didn't look away. "I go to them. No, I let them think they've won. I go, and you follow, not as a rescuer, as an end. No. It's the only way we get close enough." "Zariah?" "I'm not the same person who hung on their fire," she said, stepping closer. "I'm not afraid of them anymore. But I need you to trust me." He clenched his jaw. "You're asking me to let you walk into hell." She placed her hands on his face. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you I'll come back." The silence between them cracked under the weight of what she proposed. But beneath it, something stronger held. She wasn't surrendering. She was hunting. Adrian finally nodded. "Then we end this." And from the distant dark, the Flamebound loomed closer, ancient and hungry. But this time, fire would not have its way. They came for her in silence. Adrian watched from the far edge of the crater as Zariah stood tall on the plateau, bare to the stars, no armor, no weapon, nothing but the shimmer beneath her skin and the storm behind her eyes. The Pyranax flagship descended like a wound in the sky, its hull etched in molten glyphs, vast and slow and heavy with purpose. It didn't land, it hovered. A platform extended from its belly, a glowing chain of flame glass and smoke. Priests stepped forward, cloaked in burning ash and ritual steel, their faces hidden behind bone masks, their hands stretched in reverence. They welcomed her like a goddess. Zariah didn't speak. She walked forward, barefoot across the platform, into the very mouth of the vessel that once marked her for slaughter. The chains they offered her, she didn't resist. She wore them like silk. Inside the Flamebound, she let them surround her, chant over her, prepare the pyre anew. But this time, the fire did not hiss when it touched her skin. It pulsed. She was not the offering anymore. She was the flame. Adrian, cloaked in a stolen thermal mesh suit, slipped aboard in the blind spot of ceremony. He moved through the half-lit halls of the ship, passing great fire pools and altars etched in blood. His rifle hung from his back, but his blade remained at his hip. He didn't need to fight his way in. Not yet. They weren't looking for an enemy. They were too busy worshipping their doom. He reached the inner sanctum, just as the final rites began. Zariah stood on a dais of obsidian, arms raised, surrounded by priests and warriors chanting in tongues not spoken by any living world. Flames licked around her, fed by ancient fuel and madness, and yet she didn't burn. She glowed. Adrian's voice echoed through the chamber, like thunder breaking scripture. "Step away from her." The priests turned, alarmed, hands flying to weapons, but Zariah lifted her hand. "No," she said, "let him come." The fire bent toward her voice. Adrian stepped into the circle of flame, the heat clawing at his armor, threatening to sear through flesh and bone. But her power met his path, parted the fire like a curtain. She met him at the center. "You came," she whispered. "You knew I would." Behind them, the high-flame priest raised his staff. "This is blasphemy," he roared. "She is the chosen vessel. Her light belongs to the eternal burn." Zariah turned slowly, eyes aflame. "No," she said, "it belongs to me." And then she moved. Not with violence, with release. The chains fell from her wrists. The fire consumed the altar, but not her. It poured into her body like it had always belonged there. Her skin blazed with color, not heat, silver and gold, violet and red. The chamber trembled. The priest staggered. Some knelt, some screamed. The ancient vessel moaned as power pulsed from her like a solar wave. Adrian stood beside her, shielding his face from the brilliance. She touched his shoulder. "Close your eyes." He did, and the light exploded. The flame-bound cracked. Fire met fire, and hers was stronger. The ship didn't burn. It unraveled. A vessel of rituals built to consume had now fed on the wrong soul, and in doing so, it had lit a flame that could not be tamed. The Starhawk drifted quietly through the remains of the flamebound, its path steady and slow. Adrian sat at the helm, one hand on the controls, the other resting over his heart. Behind him, Zariah stood at the viewport, watching the last flickers of the Pyronax shrine fade into silence. She had destroyed it not with rage, but with clarity. Not with hate, but with finality. There were no survivors, but there was no sorrow either. "Does it feel like victory?" Adrian asked, not turning. Zariah stepped closer, folding her arms around his shoulders. "No," she said softly. "It feels like breathing again." He reached up, touching her wrist. "I never asked where we go next. I never knew I could choose." She whispered. He looked up at her. "You can." The stars beyond the glass stretched like stories waiting to be written. No pursuit, no signals, just the echo of what had been. "You once said I reminded you of light," she said. He smiled faintly. "You are light. You just forgot for a little while." "And you?" He leaned back against her. "I'm just the idiot who walked into fire without a plan." She laughed. A real laugh this time. Warm, bright, alive. Then she kissed his temple and whispered, "Then I suppose you're my idiot now." He reached back, pulling her down into his lap, cradling her like something sacred, not fragile. They stayed that way, orbiting nothing, tethered only to each other. There had been fire. There had been fear. But now, there was only them. Two souls who defied ritual, shattered fate, and rewrote survival into something tender. And though the galaxy was vast and cruel and loud with the hunger of lesser gods, nothing it held could match the power of the moment when a soldier pulled a stranger from the flames and chose not to run, but to stay, and in staying, lit a fire of his own.